Picture a narrow glen in the year 1530, right where Scotland bleeds into England. It is night. A band of riders in steel bonnets comes down off the fells with someone else's cattle ahead of them and a blood feud behind them. Not one of those men could tell you whether he is English or Scottish, because out here, that question has never mattered. What matters is the name he rides under. 2.5 centuries later, the great-grandsons of those same riders are climbing into the Appalachian mountains of a brand new country, and they are carrying those names with them, worn down by clerks, softened by new spellings, but never truly lost. Today, we are counting down 15 surnames that trace straight back to that border world. Names DNA testing and genealogists have now confirmed traveled from the lawless frontier of Britain, through the plantation of Ulster, and into the coves and hollows of the American South. Some of these names belong to raiders. Some belong to refugees. One of them belongs to a president born 2 years after his parents left Ireland. Count how many you recognize. If the border had a first family, it was this one. The Armstrongs held the West March and the debatable land, that contested strip claimed by neither kingdom, and at their height, they could put 3,000 riders in the saddle. They were feared on both sides of the line, riding in quilted jackets and flat steel helmets that gave the whole riving world its nickname, the Steel Bonnets. When a raided man wanted his cattle back, he raised the hot trod, carrying a burning turf on a lance and riding armed into the other kingdom to take them. Around 1530, the most famous Armstrong of all, Johnny Armstrong of Gilnockie, rode out to meet young King James V under a flag of truce and was hanged on the spot with his men. A betrayal the border never forgave. The lawlessness grew so notorious that the Archbishop of Glasgow once cursed the raving families by name, a curse still carved into stone in Carlisle. When the crown finally cracked down, Armstrong scattered to Ulster, then to America, into Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Tennessee Hills. 3 centuries later, a quiet Ohio man from that same border stock stepped onto the surface of the moon. His name was Neil Armstrong. Deep in the debatable land beside the Armstrongs rode the Grahams, the terror of the western border. And when King James set out to pacify the frontier, no name suffered more. The crown did not simply relocate the Grahams. It tried to erase them outright. Hundreds were rounded up and transported, some to the Low Countries, most to Ireland, and a number were formally ordered never to use the name Graham again as long as they lived. They used it anyway. The name rode out the punishment, crossed to Ulster with the rest of the border families, crossed the Atlantic, and settled itself deep across the southern mountains. In Virginia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee, you can hear 2 reivers surnames knotted together in the man who patented the telephone, the Edinburgh-born inventor Alexander Graham Bell. A Graham and a Bell folded into one signature. 2 border bloodlines meeting on a single American document centuries after the crown tried to wipe one of them off the map entirely. If your family carries the Graham name and the trail runs back through the southern mountains, you are carrying proof that an attempted erasure failed, that a king's order could not outlast a stubborn surname passed hand to hand through Ulster and down the Great Wagon Road into the hills. Deep in Liddesdale, the most lawless glen on the entire frontier, rode the Elliots, a hard and numerous clan whose name still fills the valleys of the Scottish borders today. Old border families spelled it a dozen different ways across the centuries, but the single T, single L form carries the oldest Liddesdale pedigree of them all. Spelling clerks and census takers would go on to scramble further once the family crossed an ocean. The Elliots did not merely survive in that valley, they dominated it, riding alongside the Armstrongs and the Nixons in raids that bled across the border for generations, answering to their own kin before they answered to any crown. When the raving world was finally broken by force, Elliot families took the same well-worn road as their neighbors, through Ulster first, where the name planted itself deep among the Presbyterian settlers. and then across the Atlantic into the American backcountry. They scattered through Pennsylvania, down into Virginia, and on into the Carolinas and Tennessee, where the name became one more thread in the mountain fabric. If your family is Elliot, spelled any of the old dozen ways, and your people came down through Appalachia, you carry one of the oldest and hardest surnames Liddesdale ever produced. Beside the Elliots in the Middlemarch rode the Kerrs, who together with the Scots were the leading riding family of their country, supplying warden after warden to keep in order. They themselves were just as happy to break whenever it suited them. There is an old tradition that the Kerrs were left-handed, and the story goes that they built the spiral staircases of their towers to wind the wrong way, so that a left-handed swordsman defending the steps could swing freely, while a right-handed attacker found himself cramped against the stone. Whether every Kerr in history was truly left-handed hardly matters now, because the reputation stuck so hard that in parts of the borders a left-handed person is still called Kerr-handed to this day. Whatever the truth of their sword arms, the Kerrs were among the most active raving families on the entire line, feuding, raiding, and holding office in the same breath. When the border was finally pacified and broken apart by the crown, the Kerrs took the same road so many others did, through Ulster and into the American backcountry beyond it. If your name is Kerr, spelled Kerr, Carr, or Carr, and your people came down through the southern mountains, your clan may have once guarded a border with a sword in its left hand. The Bells were an Annandale riding family, allied to their neighbors one season and feuding with them the next, and today theirs is one of the most common surnames found anywhere in the southern mountains. On the border itself, the Bell name meant something entirely different from the quiet word it sounds like now. It belonged to one of the riding clans so notorious for raiding, robbery, and bloodshed that they were counted among the Devil's Dozen, the families the crown feared most on the entire frontier. The Bells rode with the Armstrongs and the Grahams, through country where no king's law truly reached, where a man's only real protection was his surname and the kinsman who would ride to avenge him if he fell. They lifted cattle, burned farms, and carried feuds forward for generations, without ever settling a single one of them for good. When the crown finally crushed the border reivers in the early 1600s, Bell families scattered like the rest, funneling into Ulster and then onward across the Atlantic, carrying their hard frontier instincts straight into the Appalachian mountains. If your name is Bell and your people came through the southern backcountry, that quiet, ordinary-sounding word may be the surname of horse-riding raiders who once terrorized a border for 300 years running. The Johnstons, sometimes spelled with a final E on the end, were a power in their own right along the West March, and their feud with the Maxwells stands as the longest and bloodiest single vendetta in all of border history, a grudge that burned across generations and left the old records soaked in it from start to finish. It was never a quiet rivalry. Johnstons and Maxwells raided each other's cattle, burned each other's farms, and ambushed each other's riders in a cycle of retaliation that outlasted the men who started it. Passed down like an inheritance nobody wanted, but nobody would abandon either. When the crown finally broke the power of the riding families, the Johnstons went the way of their neighbors, planting themselves deep in Ulster before crossing the Atlantic into the American backcountry, where the name spread through Pennsylvania and down into the mountains beyond. The spelling loosened with every generation of American clerks who touched it. If your family spells it Johnston, Johnstone, or simply Johnson today, you may be looking at a riding surname worn smooth by 3 centuries of paperwork. The edges rounded off a name that once belonged to one side of the bloodiest feud the border ever produced. Here the story turns, and honesty matters. Campbell is not a border name at all. The Campbells were the great Highland clan of Argyll, lords of Inverary, the single most powerful kindred in the Western Highlands, and their world of locks and galleys sat a long way from the muddy cattle paths of the border country. But the plantation of Ulster did not draw only on the lowlands and the border. A large body of Highland Scots crossed over as well, especially out of Argyll and the Southern Isles, and they carried their names with them into the new settlements. Campbell became one of the most common surnames in Ulster within a generation, and from there, one of the most common the Scots-Irish carried onward to America. Genealogists studying Scots-Irish DNA today find that better than a third of these families trace to Highland rather than lowland roots, and Campbell sits right at the very top of that Highland list alongside MacDonald. So when you meet a mountain Campbell in the hollows of Appalachia, you are not meeting a border reiver at all. You are meeting the Highlands themselves, folded quietly into the Ulster stream and carried west with everyone else who made that same long crossing. Across the whole Scots-Irish world, you find the Patronymics, MacLelland, McConnell, McDowell, McKinley, and McCoy, that last one drawn from the Gaelic Mac Aod, son of Hugh, a cousin of the Highland name Mackay. It would have stayed an ordinary backcountry name except for what happened along one muddy river. Before I show you how that story ends, if you want to look at your own results and see where border and Ulster bloodlines fit into your family tree, I put together a full 3-volume PDF guide bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people miss. The feud ran along the Tug Fork dividing Kentucky from West Virginia between the family of Randolph-McCoy and the family of William Anderson Hatfield, known as Devil Ants. It caught fire in 1878 over a hog Randolph claimed was his, a doomed romance, an election day stabbing, and a cabin burned on New Year's night followed, and more than a dozen people died before it ended. In 2003, descendants of both families signed a symbolic truce, a century and a quarter after the first blood was spilled. Wallace comes from an old word meaning foreigner, the same root that gives us Welsh, and it originally marked the ancient Britons of Strathclyde, who held out in the southwest of Scotland long after their neighbors had been absorbed into other kingdoms. Its most famous bearer needs no introduction. The freedom fighter Sir William Wallace, killed in 1305 and remembered ever since as the man who defied a crown far larger than his own. The surname rode the border edges for centuries before it ever crossed to Ulster, picking up lowland families along the way who carried it into the plantation settlements of the early 1600s. From Ulster, it crossed the Atlantic like so many of its neighbors, landing at Philadelphia and Charleston, before pushing inland up the Great Wagon Road into the backcountry nobody else wanted. Wallace appears by the dozen on the old 17th century Ulster muster rolls, the lists of fighting men every estate was required to keep, long before the name ever reached a Carolina courthouse or a Tennessee deed book. It is not a glamorous name in the way a raving surname is glamorous, but it is everywhere in the mountains, steady and unremarkable on the surface. If yours is Wallace, you are standing in the main current of this migration, not its edges. Crawford is a lowland name drawn from the lands of that same name in Lanarkshire, and long before it ever crossed to Ulster it rode the border edges close enough to the raving families to share their world without ever quite belonging to the most notorious of them. The name appears steadily across the old Scottish lowland records, tied to a specific stretch of ground rather than to any single deed of raiding or feuding, which is part of why it never earned the fearsome reputation of an Armstrong or a Graham. When the plantation of Ulster opened up land for lowland Scots willing to cross the Channel, Crawford families went in the same waves as their neighbors, settling into the muster rolls and church registers of the new settlements alongside the border names they had lived beside for generations. From Ulster, the name crossed the Atlantic and pushed up the Great Wagon Road into the backcountry, landing in Pennsylvania before drifting south into Virginia, the Carolinas, and the Tennessee Hills. It shows up again and again in old deed books and census pages without ever attaching itself to a single famous feud or a single hanged reiver. If your family is Crawford and the trail runs back through the southern mountains, you are carrying one of the steady, working names of this migration. Patterson is simply son of Patrick, a patronymic as plain and direct as they come, and it became one of the steadiest, most widespread Ulster Scots names to cross the Atlantic in the whole migration. Unlike the reiving surnames that carry a feud or a hanging behind every mention, Paterson carries no legend at all, just generation after generation of families quietly named for a father and a father's father, going back further than any single record can confirm. The name appears by the dozen on the 17th century Ulster muster rolls, the same lists that tracked Wallace and Crawford. Evidence of just how common it had become among the Presbyterian settlers pouring into the plantation. When the waves of emigration began in earnest in the early 1700s, Patersons crossed with everyone else, landing mostly at Philadelphia and pushing inland up the Great Wagon Road into the backcountry nobody else wanted. The name spread through Pennsylvania and down into Virginia, the Carolinas, and Tennessee, embedding itself so deeply into the mountain world that it became one of the fixtures of Appalachian life, unremarkable precisely because it was everywhere. If your family is Paterson and your people came down through the southern mountains, you are standing in the broad, steady current of this migration, rather than at any single dramatic turn in it. Everyone knows the line, King of the Wild Frontier, dead at the Alamo in 1836. David Crockett was born on the Nolichucky River in what is now Greene County, Tennessee, in 1786, deep in the heart of Scots-Irish backcountry. But the Crockett name itself carries a surprising root, and it is worth telling straight. It began in France as Crocketain, a Huguenot family of Protestants who fled Catholic persecution rather than abandon their faith. They settled in Ulster, like so many other refugees of the period, and there they married into the Ulster Scots families around them until the two bloodlines were fully entangled. Davy's own ancestor, Joseph Lewis Crockett, married Sarah Stewart, an Ulster Scot from County Donegal, and by the time the family reached Tennessee generations later, the French origin had faded to little more than a faint memory buried under an American spelling. Davy himself rose from a hard-scrabble cabin to the United States Congress, where he broke with Andrew Jackson and stood almost alone against the Indian Removal Act that drove the Cherokee from their land. When the voters turned him out of office, he went to Texas, and he died at the Alamo on the 6th of March, 1836. French root, Ulster soil, American legend, all folded into one surname. Here is the most beloved name on the frontier, and here is where the story has to be told carefully, because you will check. Daniel Boone, the man who cut the wilderness road through the Cumberland Gap and founded Boonesboro in 1775, was not Scots-Irish by blood at all. The Boones were English Quakers. Daniel's father, Squire Boone, was a weaver from Bradninch in Devon, England, and his mother, Sarah Morgan, came from a Welsh Quaker family. Daniel himself was born in Pennsylvania in 1734. So why does he belong in this story? Because he lived it completely. The Boones traveled the very same road as the Ulster Stream, down the Great Wagon Road into the Yadkin Valley of North Carolina, and Daniel married Rebecca Bryan, whose family was Scots-Irish through and through, of that same backcountry stock. In 1775, he led axemen through the Cumberland Gap to carve the Wilderness Road into Kentucky, the path tens of thousands of settlers would follow west behind him. He was captured by the Shawnee, adopted into the tribe, and given the name Big Turtle before he slipped away to warn Boonesboro of a coming attack. Boone became the archetype of a frontier that was overwhelmingly Ulster in its making, an English Quaker who walked the Scots-Irish road until the road claimed him as one of its own. Think of the Overmountain men. On the 7th of October, 1780, a backwoods army of Scots-Irish riflemen climbed a ridge in South Carolina called Kings Mountain and destroyed a loyalist force in about an hour. A turning point of the revolution in the South. At their head rode a man named John Sevier, known on the frontier as Nolichucky Jack. He had already helped found the Watauga settlements, and in 1784 he was elected governor of a breakaway mountain state called Franklin, that Congress refused to ever recognize. When Tennessee finally entered the Union in 1796, Sevier became its first governor, and his lifelong rivalry with Andrew Jackson nearly ended in a duel between the two men. Like Crockett, his name carries its own twist. Sevier is the anglicized form of Xavier, a Huguenot family out of the old border kingdom of Navarre who fled France for England and then for America generations before John was born. So the man who led the Scots-Irish charge at King's Mountain did not bear a Scots-Irish name at all. He bore a French one, carried across 2 centuries and 2 oceans. He belongs here anyway, because the frontier never checked papers. It took the Huguenot and the borderer alike and forged them into one mountain people under fire. Of all of them, one name stands at the very front: Andrew Jackson. His parents, Andrew and Elizabeth, left the village of Bonibefore, just outside Carrickfergus in County Antrim, in 1765, 2 years before he was even born. They settled in the Waxhaws, the Scots-Irish backcountry, straddling the line between the Carolinas. And there, on the 15th of March, 1767, in a log cabin, the future 7th president came into the world. He was the first president ever born in a log cabin, and the first ever elected from west of the Appalachians, the nearest thing this country would ever have to an Ulster-born president in the White House. His enemies, who feared his temper and his will in equal measure, called him King Andrew behind his back. The mountains that raised him called him Old Hickory instead, and the name stuck harder than the insult ever did. From a cottage in County Antrim to the White House in a single generation, that is the Scots-Irish story compressed down into one life, one family, one crossing. And it is the reason this founding stock looms as large as it does over everything that came after it in American history. So there they are, the 15 names riding the credits one more time. Armstrong and Graham, off the debatable land. Elliot and Kerr, out of Liddesdale. Bell and Johnston, carrying an Annandale feud across an ocean. Campbell folded down out of the Highlands. McCoy tangled in a hillside vendetta. Wallace, Crawford, and Patterson steady in the main current the whole way. Crockett and Sevier hiding a French route under a Scots-Irish coat. Boone walking the Ulster road as an Englishman. And Jackson, born in a cabin 2 years after his parents left County Antrim behind for good. Geneticists call what happened next a founder effect. Isolated families marrying within their own world for generation after generation, until their descendants carried a signature distinct enough to map. But here is the honest word this channel will always give you. A shared surname is not proof of a shared bloodline. Thousands of unrelated households carried these same names across the water. The only way to know your own line for certain is the slow way. Parish register, ship manifest, census page, one generation at a time. The name is the door. The research is the house. If your name was among these 15, subscribe and tell us which one you carry.
Thanks for watching. Before you head out, don't let your DNA profile just sit there collecting digital dust. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook and finally make sense of it all tonight.